So we get to finally talk about the iPad second generation, which actually came out in 2011, but in my opinion, this was one of the best iPads Apple ever made, and going from one iPad to the other, we've really only seen a couple of these types of improvements in their whole entire life. I think another time Apple did something like this was like the iPad mini 5 to the iPad mini 6, the iPad Air 3 to the iPad Air 4, and especially the iPad Pro second generation to that iPad Pro third generation with that newer bezel-less design. Now with this iPad second generation, this was the second iPad that Apple ever made, and it was following the somewhat kind of success of the iPad first generation, but I will tell you, Apple did a lot of different things right with this iPad. Well, they really didn't do so well on the first generation iPad, but it's still completely okay. Now, I will probably tell you I wouldn't recommend buying an iPad second generation in 2022. It's severely outdated. It makes no sense to buy anymore, but if you want to still buy another iPad or two that I would recommend this year, links will be down in the description. You can get them from there and help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the exterior, the screen of the iPad second generation is still pretty good. 9.7 inch IPS panel, 768 by 1024, so pretty decent resolution. And it is a very good looking panel for sure. Is it perfect? No, you still have a lot of bezel around this thing, but at that time in 2011, I'm sure this was one of the best looking tablets in the market, and this was probably equivalent to the iPad Pros that we have nowadays. So I think the panel itself and the design and everything is still pretty good. The panel itself is pretty decent, and it still feels really, really good in the hand. It has great heft to it. It doesn't feel like a cheap iPad or cheap tablet. If you look at a lot of other tablets that came out in 2011, I owned tons of tablets from this day and age, and there were only a couple that I can think of that weren't like super cheap, but the rest of them, like 95% of the market at that point, they weren't really that expensive. The iPad second generation was a really, really premium feeling iPad at that point. Now we have that older 30-pin connector on this iPad, as well as a headphone jack as well, so we can go ahead and charge this thing up, and we can go ahead and transfer data with that. And we had that headphone jack, which was really cool. We had this metallic back, which looked extremely premium as well, and we had that aluminum back as well. The Apple logo was situated right there, and overall when you feel this thing and you hold it, this thing felt extremely premium. Now you may have noticed that I missed kind of a really important thing with this iPad. These were the first iPads to bring a camera setup on this specific thing, and this was a really, really important thing for sure. Now funny enough, this thing had a back camera and it had a front-facing camera as well. Now these were definitely not the best performing cameras today in today's standards, but at that point there weren't even a lot of tablets that had cameras on them. So for this thing having a back camera and a front camera, that was a really big deal in my opinion, and that kind of just opened up a lot more different use cases for this iPad. Now like I mentioned, the cameras weren't amazing, but you could take 720p videos on that back camera, and that front camera was VGA quality, which is like 0.3 megapixels or something, definitely not something high, but it was good enough for a lot of people. And if you're trying to do like FaceTime calls or different things like that, dude, this type of camera is really good for a lot of you, and I'm sure for a majority of people watching this video, it would probably in 2011, you would probably be happy with this type of camera quality. Now I don't know if you can even do certain types of features with this type of camera, and even something like an iPhone 5 camera was way better than this thing, but still it was an iPad that brought a camera, and now people could actually utilize a bigger display and just a more powerful tablet with the camera setup as well, which is really, really awesome. So in terms of the camera setup, that pretty much covers it up there. Now in terms of longevity, this thing actually started off with iOS 4, and it did get upgradable to iOS 9.3.5, which was, really cool. It lasted for quite a bit of times in terms of software, and that's why Apple did a really good job with the iPad second generation. It was such a solid performing machine in terms of just the build quality, the look of it, but also just the longevity of it. This thing lasted for a long period of time, and I'm actually really happy about that. Like I said, this thing's not getting any more software updates, so it doesn't really make any sense to buy it anymore. But it's still a kind of an emblem in Apple's ecosystem for sure, of just the historicness of the iPad second generation. Now moving on to the performance side of things, this thing had that Apple A5 chip inside of it, a dual-core CPU with 512 megabytes of RAM. Now there were a lot of different storage models, 3 different ones for this iPad, a 16, 32, and 64 gigabyte model, and that's actually a kind of a lot of storage to have on an iPad, especially back in 2011. Now in this day and age, I still think this iPad is still pretty poor in terms of performance in this day and age, stage, but that's not to say that at one point this was not the best tablet you could buy. Back in 2011, even probably till like 2012, 2013, this was a really fast iPad you could pick up, and that's a really strong thing from Apple. You know, they did a really good job with this iPad at that moment. It pretty much had the same chipset as I think the iPhone 4S or iPhone 5. I think this thing had the same chipset as something like an iPhone 4 or 4S. I think it was the iPhone 4. And I think that was a pretty good thing, you know. I mean, this thing was a pretty fast performing tablet, and really anything you were going to do with it at that point would probably be able to handle you just fine. The only problem with it nowadays is that this tablet is severely outdated. So because of that, you can't even download the most recent version of applications, let alone the software. So what happens here is if you try to go ahead and download the latest version of, you know, like TikTok or Snapchat or some notes applications or anything, most of these applications haven't even supported iOS 11 in probably a long time. So because iOS 9 came out a long time ago, you're really not going to be getting the most recent version of software there, but you're also not going to be getting all those new features and performance increases and everything like that. So that's kind of another disadvantage with this iPad. So really the performance, you know, I guess if you're using all those iOS 9 applications, it's really not going to be too bad, but it's very limited because most of the applications you can't really download, or you can't download the most recent version of those apps on this phone. So that's kind of a disadvantage here, but I do think on every other purpose of this iPad, you will probably be okay. I don't think it was a bad performing tablet of all time, but I do think if you're planning on buying this thing, you know, in 2022 and planning on using it, it's probably not going to be a good experience for you, and you're probably not going to be super happy about it. So in terms of performance, that covers it up there. Now in terms of battery life, surprisingly, this thing actually had a pretty big size battery at that moment. It was a 6,930 mAh battery, and the big thing to keep in mind with this iPad is that because it's like almost 11 years old as of this point, the big thing about iPads and just old technology is that the batteries degrade over time. So you can go ahead and buy this iPad today, unless it's brand new, the battery has probably severely degraded, so it's not at that full almost 7,000 mAh, it's probably at like 4,000 something, probably even less than that. So I will tell you, when you have these type of older tablets and older devices, the battery sizes, you know, is one thing, but it's probably not at that same size anymore, and it's probably degraded over time. But at that moment, like I mentioned in 2011, it was probably a really good performing iPad, and I'm sure a lot of people liked it too. So in terms of battery, that pretty much covers it up. And to be completely honest, I think the iPad second generation is still a very solid iPad for what it was when it first came out. I think it has a lot of history with Apple, and I think from going from the iPad, 1 to the iPad 2, Apple did a tremendous job. They eventually made even bigger waves and bigger design changes, but this was a really big update, especially for a second generation iPad. I think they did a really, really good job with it. Now, my only concern, well, I have a lot of concerns. I wouldn't recommend buying this thing anymore. Performance really isn't that good. It's not getting updates anymore. The cameras really aren't that great. And even like the base iPad from like 2 years ago is a million times better than this thing. But I still like this iPad. I think it's more of like a collector's item nowadays. And it's more interesting just to look at, looking at an iPad like the second generation, you can definitely see how every single iPad and most other Apple products have taken, design cues from these iPads in order to make them, into better products nowadays. So I think ultimately that pretty much covers it up. If you guys have any other questions or anything, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that will mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.